Hey folks, Wally DM here, and today we're going to take a look at the Dyadic D20. Now this is a double D10 0 through 9 20-sided die set by Tower House Creative, and a big thanks to Elton for sending these over. If you recall, Tower House Creative is also responsible for the Fate Mail D20, and I reviewed the Fate Mail D20 on my channel a few months ago, so be sure to check out that video as well. But let's open it up. Again, this is Dyadic D20, and this should provide a little bit of nostalgia for old school gamers, as these resemble vintage dice from the 1970s. Now included in the purchase of the Dyadic D20 are the two dice. We have one black and one red. We have a nice little short story that introduces the dice. We have a card that shows you how to use the Dyadic D20 dice, and we have this really cool sticker. So what is the Dyadic 20 and how do you use it? Well, this is going to serve as 4 different dice. We have the D20, the D2, the D10, or the percentile die. Now, in order to use these as a D20, you're going to roll either the black or the red die, and the outline or the blank numbers are going to be 1 through 10, and the solid numbers are going to be 11 through 20. So for instance, I'll roll here. We have an outline 3, so the result is going to be a 3. If we have a solid 0, that's going to be a natural 20. Solid 3, that's a 13. And one more, an outline of a 1, that's a natural 1. If you need to flip a coin or use a D2, you simply roll one of the dice, and if it's an outline, it's a 1. If it's a solid, it's a 2. We have an outline, so that's a 1. We can also use these as a D10, as they were back in the 1970s. This is a 0 through 9 twice die, so any result's going to be the result of our D10. So we have a 7, a 10, and a 1. And then finally, we can use these as percentile die. The black die is going to represent the tens column, while the red die represents the ones column. Rolling them together, we have an 8 and a 4, so that's going to be an 84. One more time, we have a 5 and a 4, so that'll be 54. Now, in addition to being a dynamic dice set, the Dyadic D20 also represents the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Taking a look at an old school 0 through 9 twice D20, this is a replica or a similar die that you would have seen in the 1970s. So those of you not familiar with old school vintage dice from the 1970s are probably asking yourself, why were these numbered 0 through 9? Where did these D20s come from? And more importantly, how did you figure out the result of a roll 1 through 20 when there's only 10 possible results? So let's take a quick look at the history of how the D20 was included in Dungeons & Dragons and how you would read the results of these vintage dice. So where did the original D20 0 through 9 numbered twice come from? Well, prior to the release of the original Dungeons & Dragons, co-creator Dave Arneson had taken a trip to England. It was there at a gaming store that he found 20-sided dice that were 0 through 9, numbered twice, in black and red. When working on Blackmore, which was the precursor to Dungeons & Dragons, Dave remembered the D20s and decided to incorporate them. When Dave, Gary Gygax, and TSR began working on Dungeons & Dragons, they wanted to include the 20-sided die. However, the only place that they could find them that could supply TSR with those dice was an educational company on the West Coast called Creative Publications, but the D20s that they were after were sold in sets. Included with the 20-sided die, again, 0 through 9 numbered twice, was a 4, 6, 8, and 12-sided die. So rather than pulling out the 6-sided and the 20-sided die to use in Dungeons & Dragons, Gary, Dave, and TSR decided to incorporate all of the dice into the rules. Throughout the entirety of the 1970s, Dungeons & Dragons dice always had 0 through 9 numbered twice, and it wasn't until the 1980s that they started incorporating the actual numbers 11 through 20. Now you may notice that there's no D10 included, and in fact the first D10 didn't arrive to Dungeons & Dragons until approximately the release of the Moldvay Basic set. But that's not to say that percentile and a D10 weren't required for Dungeons & Dragons, and that's where our D20 0 through 9 twice comes in. This die by itself can act as a D20, a D10, and a percentile, depending on how you roll them. Now back in the 1970s, the D20 was either filled or not filled, and depending on which die you had, determined on how you would determine the results. Now the original D20 was whites with black numbers, very similar to this replica that you can see here, and the way that you would use this for a D20 result is you would add a 6-sided die, you would roll both of them, and the D6 would determine whether your 20-sided die was a 1 through 10 result or an 11 through 20, depending on the result of the D6. So if you rolled 1, 2, or 3 on the 6-sided die, along with a 2 on our D20, this would be a 2. Rolling a 5 on our 6-sided die and a 9 on our D20, the result of this would be a 19. And if we were to roll a 4, 5, or 6 on the 6-sided die and a 0 on the D20, then this is going to be a natural 20. And of course, if we rolled a 1, 2, or 3, then the result would be a 10. Now, another way that gamers in the 70s would differentiate their 1 through 10 from their 11 through 20 is they would color some of the sides. Then the side that is colored would be 1 through 10, and the side that wasn't colored would be 11 through 20. Now, of course, if you didn't want to color the entire side, some gamers just chose to put a dot on one of those sides. And then, of course, if you received a D20 that was not filled in with the numbers, then you could take a white crayon and you could fill in half of the numbers. And this is where our similarities to the Dyadic D20 comes in. So as you can see here, we can fill in half of the numbers, so we'll make these white, and the other half are not filled in. So those could be similar to the outline. So taking a look at our Dyadic D20 versus our old school D20, the white numbers would be 11 through 20, and the unfilled numbers would be 1 through 10. But of course, without filling in half the numbers, those are a bit hard to read. So a lot of D&D players in the 70s would take a second color crayon and color in the other numbers. And as you can see here, I have colored half of the numbers in white and the rest of them in black. And now my 1970s 20-sided die, 0 through 9 twice, looks very similar to the Dyadic D20. So now that we've taken a look at a little bit of the history of the D20 and how the 0 through 9 twice D20s were rolled in the 1970s, you can see why I'm so excited about this Dyadic D20 set. These dice are excellent quality and they look really good. They're practical and they have that bit of nostalgia feel and that callback to the early days of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm super excited to have them in my collection, and a big thanks to Elton from Tower House Creative for sending these to me for my review. I'm really excited about them. If you'd like to pick up a set for your own collection, I'll put a link in the description below, and don't forget to check out the video on the Fate Mill D20. That video was a lot of fun. So that's all I have for you today. What did you think of the Dyadic D20 set? Did this video bring about a little bit of nostalgia, or you like me, did you learn something new today? Did you have an old school 0 through 9 twice D20, and do you still have it? Be sure to leave a comment below. Thank you very much for watching, and on to the next.